Counter-UAS as a service is this notion that a system integrator is providing the equipment, the software updates, the spares, the logistics. They're doing everything except for operating the system in the sense of initiating that mitigation to provide a lot more agility to meet some of these timing challenges that are upon us.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the U.S. Department of Defense each year, but so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley.
Today's guest is Greer Carper. After beginning his career in corporate finance at Boeing and helping to establish its corporate venture capital arm, Greer moved over to portfolio company Fortem Technologies to serve as CFO and lead corporate development. Fortem is fundamentally a radar company, but it's become one of the biggest players in counter-drone technologies. The company started commercial and today has a robust defense business with a sizable international presence. They've used cyber and OTAs to get in the game, and today are on the precipice of large-scale deployments with the Department of Defense. Let's dive in. All right, so today's guest is Greer Carper, the Senior Vice President of Corporate Development and Strategy at Fortem Technologies. Greer, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Noah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Greer, you've got a really cool background for the program because you've seen companies transitioning and crossing the valley of death in two places now. Background investing at Boeing and operating at Boeing, and now in this strategy and corp dev role at Fortem. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the defense market in the first place, and bring us up to speed on what it is a VP of strategy or SVP of strategy and corp dev does at a defense tech company.
Well, no, I'll tell you, I've been in the defense and aerospace world for the last 15 years now, and of which I've worked big aerospace programs like F-15 and JDAM. I've worked scrappy UAS upstarts like In Situ, which makes the ScanEagle UAV, was part of the founding team of Boeing Horizon X Ventures, which was Boeing's corporate capital fund, now AI Horizon X. And I've had a lot of roles in strategy, M&A, investment planning, strategic partnerships, financial planning, and the like. But I'll tell you, when I got started in the space, I started in finance. My background's accounting, but I was enamored with the defense space early on in my career and thought that was a place I wanted to work in. I had this sort of dissonance that later became very apparent when I joined the defense space. When I was in high school and in college, you had shows like Future Weapons that were talking about all this bleeding edge tech, all these new capabilities are coming to bear. Yet when you actually get into the defense space, particularly big aerospace, you find that a lot of that is perhaps more on the R&D side. It's a little bit more aspirational. And what's actually deployed and used today is a little bit older and perhaps isn't as connected to one another as one may think. And as such, a lot of my career has been around almost trying to reconcile, that kind of lofty aspiration of what the future state could look like versus, what's deployed today, how it's being used, and what are our abilities to modify, amend, and tailor not just the technology products themselves, but also the techniques, the tactics and procedures associated with the use of those systems. And so I've been on this journey for, again, 15 years now or so, and worn a lot of hats over that time. And currently at Fortem, I'm doing a lot more fundraising and corporate strategy kind of stuff. So think go-to-market strategy, look at the market landscape and all the developments therein.
So you were part of, effectively a startup inside one of our nation's largest defense companies at Boeing, with Horizon X, and now as a part of the AEI partnership, but launching this corporate venture angle inside a large prime. Why the decision to move to an operational role in a growing company as opposed to what you were doing at Boeing?
When I got started at Boeing, particularly in the strategy department, I started at the highest echelon, if you will, or organization within Boeing Defense. And so I was going through the J book every year on building what that fiscal year spin is going to look like across RDTE and procurement and O&M, across all the major programs, understanding what that market size was for different kinds of subsegments, be it rotorcraft, be it fighter aircraft, weapon systems, and the like. While that kind of analysis is quite interesting and it's very illustrative into where the customer or DoD end user may be going, at the same time, it's a bit abstract. And so one can pontificate about, well, we think that this given market segment, take satellites as an example, is going to grow by a 10, 15% CAGR, and that maybe we should invest in that. That's sort of a different kind of take versus the much more sort of down in the trenches perspective of, well, what's our right to win? How are we positioned within our existing programs? Where do we think the customer's going to go with these new opportunities, and what are they going to require out of it? And so just because you see a market that may be growing doesn't mean that you have a good right to win there. And that encouraged me to kind of go deeper into the lower levels of Boeing, particularly around individual programs, where you're making very specific decisions around how one positions these multi-decade long franchises to endure over time. And for many defense primes, and Boeing's not alone at this, it's about taking those existing programs of record and iterating upon them in a way that allows them to continue to be relevant. I found that kind of strategy really compelling because you are actually not just engaging with what you see in the public record, the FedUp, but also talking to individual business development and customer-facing folks who are providing that voice to the customer and what they actually care about or what they will be caring about in the future. Oftentimes, in the business development world, in defense, it's about shaping. And so, I remember early on when I was starting my career, I was told, if you don't know the requirements of an RFP before it comes out, you really haven't done your job in BD, which is really to say, oh, if you don't actually have that customer intimacy and know what is coming, then someone else probably does. And they probably already position themselves to capture that opportunity. That speaks volumes to how long it takes to successfully implement a strategy to get to those kind of outcomes you're looking for. The cycles are not in months, they're in years. And when you consider things like with the FitUp, process of design, that budget, I mean, right now, it's May 2024, they're most certainly talking about markups around the FY25 budget, but the FY25 budget, the PB, the presidential budget submission was done. It was released in April. It was more or less done 5-6 months prior to that. And so if you wanted to shape or influence that budget, I mean, that's going back more than a year at minimum to go about that. And so if you want to impact the 26 budget, you may be a little bit, your time is thin, and maybe 2027 makes a lot more sense in that respect. But if I'm a startup and you're telling me, okay, it's 2024 right now, and that I may have the ability to shape or influence the 2027 future budget, that's a 2.5 years away almost in terms of when I'm going to realize some kind of sales order, let alone revenue.
So, Greer, what was the state of Fortem as a company when they made the decision to bring you on in this role? I think people ask, people think a little bit about strategy roles in startups. Is that something that, is that a day one thing? Is that a Series A thing? Is that a Series B thing? Like, just help us understand where the company was at in deciding to create this role and to fill it.
Well, I'll tell you that for my particular circumstance, much like many folks who join or get involved in venture capital, is that everyone has sort of a unique way of how they got in. My role at Fortem, which was originally the chief financial officer, was done out of pretty unfortunate circumstances. Fortem had hired a CFO who I was very impressed with, and unfortunately he had to go on medical leave. And yet they also needed to fundraise at the same time. And so I had been, for many years, Boeing's board observer for Fortem. And so I knew the company pretty well. I knew the products pretty well. And given the focus on fundraising, I was given this opportunity to join the company. Now, it also so happened that Fortem was transitioning from, I would say, a 50% pure commercial focus, commercial in the sense of, think advanced air mobility, last mile, middle mile package delivery, applications where we're not trying to mitigate a drone. We're trying to ensure that drone operations take place safely without jeopardizing the integrity of the national airspace system. About 50% of the business was that, 50% was defense. And so when it became clear that more and more of the company was going to be focused on defense, given my background, it made a lot of sense to join and help with fundraising and with strategy and CFO kinds of stuff. Now, that said, I am not a operations CFO. I mean, that's most of my background's much more on the ivory tower kind of side of things and not closing the books every month and other things around those lines. But that's it. You learn, you figure it out. I mean, I have a bachelor's in accounting, and so it was sort of dusting off old principles, and it was fun in that respect. But that said, like in startups, all executive leadership are wearing lots of hats, and so it's not as if it was a non-starter for me not to have that kind of in the trenches accounting experience, because we had a strong controller, and sometimes having that right team can allow you to transition into those kind of roles, even though that you may not have that experience that otherwise would be required.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing some of your background and experience, Greer. And let's pivot now to the company itself, because this program is really about the stories of companies who have gone from those first touch points to kind of scale production deployments inside the Department of Defense and the defense market broadly. Tell us a little bit about Fortem. How did the company's genesis in the commercial markets, how did it enter the defense space? What was the first product, and where was the kind of the front door for Fortem?
Well, Fortem Technologies is the single source provider for solutions to detect, track, and identify and mitigate hostile drone threats using radar, AI, and interceptor drones. We're best known for our drone hunter system, which intercepts hostile drones using a net-based capture system. The Army calls this the low collateral effects interceptor and uses it among many types of end effectors within the forward area air defense command and control system, which is the Counter-UAS system for small UAS used by the Army, not just in the United States, but also abroad. We are, again, one end effector among many. And so you may also have RF-based end effectors, EW-based end effectors, Raytheon Coyote as a hit-to-kill interceptor being, again, one of many that may be utilized by that system. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Fortem is a leader in drone warfare, and that our systems today are deployed all across the world. We've been deployed at Davos, at the Qatar World Cup. We've been in Ukraine for the last 2 years, supporting both the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior. And lastly, with the U.S. Army, we have a prototype OTA in place. An operational assessment was completed last year, and we're on a path to a production OTA in 2025. But we did not get started within the defense space. Fortem fundamentally is a small size, weight, and power AESA radar company. So we make a frequency modulated continuous wave AESA radar. Think a radar that is more range than an automotive radar, but a whole lot less range compared to a traditional aviation radar. We were going after the advanced air mobility space or the urban air mobility space. So think, again, last mile package delivery, middle mile package delivery, air taxis, as a detect and avoid radar. Because as a autonomous system in the air, you need to worry about not just cooperative air traffic, which is to say aircraft that have a transponder, but also non-cooperative aircraft. In the United States, we still have general aviation aircraft that in some cases don't have any transponders because it's not required. And so you have to worry about and be cognizant of that kind of activity, those participants in the airspace, and be able to remain we're clear of them. And so as a company, we were focused on those kinds of use cases, both ground-based radar sensors, so think like for vertiports or airports, but also onboard radar for UAS from Group 2 to Group 3 in size. We had a lot of success in selling hundreds of radar units to lots of different companies, from companies doing automated air traffic management to companies developing air taxis. But much like many companies within that advanced mobility space, particularly those that are really building their business model on volume, which is to say lots of unmanned things flying regularly in the national airspace system, the regulatory environment simply hadn't matured as fast as I think many had hoped for. And as such, it's one thing to sell lots of ones and twos kind of units to different companies for test and evaluation. It's another thing for those platforms to be type certified and to be put into a state where they're producing 10 or even 100 a month for some kind of production service. And so In this, Fortem began considering pivoting to defense. And in 2017, we won an AFRL SBIR around taking that same onboard detect and avoid radar, but instead of identifying drones to remain well clear of them, we wanted to get closer to them. And AFRL had this idea that if you could use this to get close enough to a drone that may be of concern, a hostile drone, that you could utilize that counter drone platform, the drone hunter, to launch some kind of end effector. And as that evolution took place, that end effector became a pneumatically actuated net gun. So we get close enough to that hostile drone, we launch a net to envelop it. That net is tethered to our drone, and we ferry that drone to that's been captured to a safe location for either evidence collection or disposal. Now, some may say, well, that's a bit of a complicated set of events to capture a drone. Why not just shoot the drone out of the sky, or to jam the drone, or to hack the C2 protocol to tell it to go home? Those were all viable approaches. But we had found over time that having a solution that provides a limited, if not entirely absent, debris field, as in no collateral damage, if you will, that was something that a lot of end users were interested in, because oftentimes you're protecting a location that either has critical infrastructure, it's sensitive in nature and it needs to be protected, or it has a civilian population underneath, be it an urban environment or a public venue or whatnot. And so over the course of that SBIR activity, we were able to demonstrate that this technology, has legs and has potential. But I'll say at the end of that SBIR phase 2, I don't believe we actually had a product. We had great validation of the technical approach. And though we most certainly met well beyond all the requirements that SBIR phase 2 had, I still think that we had much to do with respect to understanding what the customer was looking for, going through that customer discovery journey, and understanding what that offering really had to look like, and to actually be utilized within the kind of customer sets that we envisioned we could go after. I'll say AFRL, Air Force Research Labs, wanted to see us push the limits. And after meeting those initial requirements, we were able to expand that scope to include different types of drone targets with different kinds of flight paths or trajectories. So think a drone that's flying a fairly well understood trajectory, perhaps, versus one that's doing an orbit mode, or perhaps is stationary. What's kind of fun to think about, though, is that this was all in 2017. And while towards the end of the SBIR contract, the 2018 NDA passed. And in the drone world, that's important because that was when the requirement that you couldn't have certain components made from the PRC. And that was challenging. Our initial version of Drone Hunter was a DJI F550, frame and Navi autopilot. Like, it wasn't anything fancy. Because again, we weren't a drone company. We were a radar company. And so we most certainly had to go through significant redesign and lots of iterations after that SBIR in order to actually have a product that we could sell to DoD customers.
Yeah, no, it's a really neat story and a great trajectory. And Greer, I think the thing that sticks with me is your reflection on where you got to at the end of the phase 2 SBIR, the end of the phase 2 SBIR, which is, you said, we didn't have a product, we had a validation of an approach. And I just want to foot stomp that for a second, because for folks listening, that is one of the most, I think, important insights that you could possibly take away from a SBIR. Now, folks will treat that program differently, but at its core, SBIR is not a buy a couple of seat licenses type line of funding. It's RDTE funding. It's meant to be taking something you may have developed even commercially if it's direct to phase 2 and tailoring it to a new use case or for a new purpose or for a new user group. And so your ability to do that and to create some of these proof points and to kind of play in the sandbox, if you will, with the Air Force Research Laboratory then sets you up to make that transition to a commercial product that can be sold at scale. So let's pick up the story there, Greer. What happens at the end of that phase 2 in terms of looking for user groups, looking for customer, looking for the productization of what you validated?
After that SBIR phase 2, we began engaging the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA for short, at the time, who, again, at this time period they were chartered with the Counter-UAS activities for DoD that eventually transitioned to the Joint Counter-UAS Office and the U.S. Army. But at the time, DTRA was most certainly interested in these kinds of end effectors. And we were awarded a prototype OTA for the drone hunter system. And so that system began a journey of development, testing, and lots of iteration around to mature it as an offering that could be viable for the U.S. Army.
Hey, Greer, let me interrupt you for a second, if you don't mind, which is to say you come at the end of this phase 2. So you now have sole source authority. You could have gone to phase 3, but you also said we don't quite have a product. So DTRA, tell us, why did DTRA choose, prototype OTA is the path to go here?
The prototype OTA, which is a middle tier acquisition path, was one that they felt like provided the most flexibility for them. And in part that had to do with not just the R&D side, the design elements of it, but also the desire to utilize that contract vehicle to do limited fielding. And limited fielding isn't just buying equipment for evaluation purposes. Is also associated with the provisioning of funds for field service representatives, or FSRs for short, which is to say your employees going out in the field and working full time at a location, be it in CONUS or outside of CONUS, to support that evaluation of that system. That provides a good amount of flexibility because in some cases, a SBIR phase 3 may have limitations in that respect. Although that said, a lot of that has to deal with the program office and the contracting officer and what they're going to be comfortable with. But at least with the Army and with many of the systems in the family of Counter-UAS systems that are out there, they rely on field service representatives to understand how these systems can be employed and maintained so that the Army can better understand how these systems need to be understood and deployed accordingly, which is not just around does it work or not, but what's the training regime that we're going to have to put together to allow uniformed personnel to operate and maintain these systems accordingly? At the same time that prototype OTA was taking place, and I'd say that the prototype OTA funding that we received to date is probably commensurate to a SBIR phase 3, just to provide kind of a level set on size. So it's not $1 million or $2 million. It's most certainly in the tens of millions. We also pursued a commercial strategy. And that commercial strategy was one where we wanted to provide the drone hunter solution to non-DoD federal customers like Department of Homeland Security, but also international customers that may have a counter-UAS mitigation need. This was a challenging pursuit because while we had sold a number of radar systems to international customers in the context of evaluation for advanced air mobility, going after customers that are focused on a very nascent space like counter-UAS, where perhaps the personnel making the decisions on purchasing such a solution may have previously been the ones deciding what kinds of metal detector systems to use, in points of entry and exit at public venues, or placement of bollards or security cameras in sensitive facilities. You're talking about a customer that is learning about this new threat, counter-UAS or drones as a whole, and yet there's a tremendous amount of trade space in the workflows around detecting, tracking, identifying, and mitigating those drones. You can use RF-based systems, software-defined radios, to detect the C2 or video links. You can utilize RF jamming or GPS jamming if you wanted to, as a mitigation solution. Each of those have different price points and different sort of levels of sophistication that the end user would have to have in order to operate. And to be frank, things like radar historically have a higher bar with respect to user proficiency compared to a camera-based system, or in some cases to an RF-based system. Software-defined radios most certainly are going to be less expensive compared to a radar-based system. And so if you have a customer that really doesn't have a good appreciation of the nuances of the trade-offs of where such systems to detect, track, and identify, are strong versus weak, or perhaps may not consider a higher end or threat as a concern. Their concern may be a civilian who's simply flying a DJI drone out of hobby and just wants to get a good photo of something. That may be very different than a drone that is not using a C2 data link, that is performing some kind of waypoint-based navigation and waypoint-based actions, like, for instance, using a drone to drop off contraband into a prison. Those higher-end use cases are going to be a little more limited. And so if I'm going to look at a system that cost me $1,000 versus $10,000, if I don't really have a good appreciation of those nuances, I'm going to choose that cheaper system. And what we often found was that all of our customers internationally were ones that had already purchased lower end systems and found that there were deficiencies within those systems in going after higher end threats. And their willingness to pursue higher end solutions like what Fortem provides was one where they had to kind of figure out, and we had to help them along the way to understand, where their gaps may be. That's not a quick sales cycle. I mean, that's a sales cycle that it takes 18, 24 months, best case scenario. And you have to be there every step of the way and helping them understand what that concept operation needs to look like to mitigate the risks that they're most concerned with. I think we found that international was an opportunity set that allowed us to really mature Drone Hunter by getting that kind of user feedback beyond just a specific U.S. Army or U.S. DoD use case. Our launch customers actually buying Drone Hunter units were actually out of Asia and Europe first. And that only took place after dozens of live demonstrations and in-country test events. And as such, we had to not just be concerned with what the training regimes that would have to be developed and matured, meet those needs, particularly if they didn't speak English as their first language or primary language. But we had to understand what other systems that they had employed already. As again, oftentimes they'd already purchased systems that had provided some level of counter-UAS detection, track, identification, and mitigation. Integration of those systems, we do often now because, again, that's where a lot of the customers have been. And even then, 18, 24 months was really best case scenario.
Even internationally, even in Asia and Europe, 18, yeah.
That's right. And I mean, in most cases, you have to have in-country partners. You have to show up. You can't rely on those in-country partners to sell it for you. And even then, they're still going to want their finder's fee. And you're going to have to pay a lot of money, up front in the form of sending your personnel, your equipment to do live demonstrations and other demonstrations to show that the systems operate. And so, we have a team of about a dozen people that's all they do is professional services and customer demos where we're flying not just our Drone Hunter as a mitigation solution, but we're flying the target drones because the customers are not going to have a bunch of target drones that they can test out with. And so you really have to start thinking about what it takes to get to those outcomes you're looking for, which means having that organic capacity to demonstrate.
Yeah, you're creating your own test and evaluation environment effectively to show what your product can do. Greer, I know we're pushing up on time here. Update us on the story on the defense side. So the SBIR through AFRL, the prototype OT through DTRA. Where is Fortem today in the journey? Are we on a path to program of record? Is this like what's the next step with all the great work and sizable deals that you all have closed? The
biggest DoD deal that we see ahead of us is a production OTA in 2025. We had that operational assessment completed already with the U.S. Army. And in the context of an OTA, an operational assessment that's been successful is that big milestone that you have to hit. Now, understand a production OTA is a contract vehicle. It's not a contract in the sense that just because you have a contract vehicle doesn't mean that you get a bunch of orders. You got to have funding associated with that. And we most certainly have been working closely with not just the U.S. Army, but also big shout out to DIU as well. While DTRA and the U.S. Army were managing that contract, a good portion of the funds came from DIU over the years. And so you can most certainly have pockets of money that are being provided by some entity, in this case, a DIU, and then utilizing a counting office and a program office to execute that accordingly. And so the production OTA is kind of the big one we see ahead of us. We think that there's a really interesting set of market changes taking place in the counter-UAS space. And this is around counter-UAS as a service, which is going to sound a bit foreign to people, but that is essentially a recognition that the counter-UAS space is moving so quickly in terms of it being a cat and mouse game. The enemy has to say that being able to say, here are the solutions that we're going to use and the training regimes that we're going to set up and how they're going to be deployed to the various formations that exist today in the Army or Air Force or otherwise, that takes a long time. I mean, setting up a training school takes a year and a half, 2 years. Setting up the training regime takes a year and a half. Setting up that first class that goes through it and then deploying them takes time. And when you start adding all that up, you realize that, this is going to take 4 or 5 years to field something. And if that solution that's being fielded is no longer relevant, in many cases, a lot of the counter-UAS systems today, have a degree of perishability. RF-based systems, as an example, are ones where I think will always have a place. But as the C2 radios transition from ISM band to a 4G or 5G band of spectrum, that changes how those systems are going to be employed. They can most certainly be updated, and many of them are. But that's sort of a comment around the changing nature of drone technology in general and how that's evolving. But all that said, Counter-UAS as a service is this notion that a system integrator is providing the equipment, the software updates, the spares, the logistics. They're doing everything except for operating the system in the sense of initiating that mitigation to provide a lot more agility to meet some of these timing challenges that are upon us. U.S. Marine Corps just had a $600 million IDIQ that was put out for such a Counter-UAS as a service. The Joint Counter-UAS Office has most certainly been talking about it and been much more vocal about it as a concept. I do think that's going to be more of a gap filler, but I think it's a recognition that the DoD needs to move faster, and this is a way of doing it.
Greer, you're a big thinker, and you've gone deep with us on not only the counter-UAS market, but just the path to getting in a game in a major way in the domestic defense market and internationally. So super grateful for your time and insight here. Before we let you go, if folks want to learn more about Fortem, they want to follow along with the journey, or they maybe even want to join the team, where should they go?
You can find at fortemtech.com. That's FORTEMTECH. .com. You can also hit me up on LinkedIn, Greer Carper. I want to thank you, Noah, for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Hey, this has been a blast. Thanks so much, Greer. We'll hope to have you back in the future.